February 19th, 1943. Erwin Rommel stood at his command post in the Tunisian hills, field glasses raised, watching American tanks maneuver in the valley below. For 3 days, his Afrika Korps had been pushing against these new opponents, and now, as another American counterattack dissolved into confusion, he lowered the glasses and turned to his staff. The assessment he would send to German High Command that evening was blunt. The Americans had not yet learned the art of war. But this story begins 6 weeks earlier, when those same Americans believed they were ready. The men of the 1st Armored Division had trained for over a year in the California desert. They'd practiced tank formations, rehearsed radio procedures, studied German tactics from Libya and Egypt. Their equipment was good, much of it better than what the Germans had. The M4 Sherman tank, with its 75mm gun and reliable engine, was a solid machine. American artillery was excellent, American logistics unmatched. On paper, the United States Army's 2nd Corps looked formidable. Major General Lloyd Fredendall commanded that corps, and he'd spent the weeks since Operation Torch establishing his headquarters. Not at the front, but 70 miles behind the lines, in a canyon near Tebessa. Engineers had blasted his command post into solid rock, creating an underground complex that one visiting British officer described as more suitable for a pharaoh's tomb than a tactical headquarters. Fredendall seemed more concerned with protecting himself than understanding his enemy. The men at the front knew something was coming. German reconnaissance had been probing American positions around Sidi Bou Zid, a dusty crossroads town in central Tunisia. American intelligence reported enemy armor concentrations. But Fredendall's dispositions made little tactical sense. He'd scattered his forces across a wide front, placed tanks on hilltops where they couldn't maneuver, separated infantry from armor support. Officers trained in combined arms doctrine found themselves ordered to defend positions that violated everything they'd learned. Private First Class Robert Rosen, 19 years old from Brooklyn, sat in his half-track on a rocky hillside east of Sidi Bou Zid on the night of February 13th. The desert cold seeped through his jacket. He could see campfires in the distance, whether friendly or enemy he couldn't tell. His unit, part of Combat Command A, had been told to hold this ground. Nobody had explained why this particular hill mattered or what they were supposed to do if attacked. The officers seemed uncertain themselves. Dawn came clear and cold on February 14th. Rosen was heating coffee on a small stove when he heard the sound. Low rumble, like distant thunder, but the sky was cloudless. The rumble grew louder. Then someone shouted, and Rosen looked east to see them. German tanks, dozens of them emerging from the morning haze, in perfect formation. The 10th Panzer Division had begun its attack. What happened over the next 4 hours would be described by American survivors as a nightmare of confusion and chaos. The German assault came from 2 directions simultaneously. The 10th Panzer from the east, the 21st Panzer from the southeast, a classic pincer movement executed with the precision of veteran units. American tanks tried to respond, but they were positioned on hilltops with no room to maneuver, silhouetted against the sky, perfect targets. German gunners, many of them veterans of 3 years of desert warfare, fired with methodical accuracy. Rosen's half-track was hit in the first 15 minutes. The explosion threw him clear, left him dazed in the rocks. When his head cleared, he saw American tanks burning across the hillside, black smoke rising into the blue sky. German panzers were already past his position, driving west, and American infantry was scrambling down the slopes, trying to reach the valley floor. There was no organized retreat, no covering fire, just men running. By noon, Sidi Bou Zid was surrounded. 2 American battalions, roughly 3,000 men, were cut off. Fredendall, from his bunker 70 miles away, ordered a counterattack to relieve them. The order reached Combat Command C late in the afternoon. Attack at dawn the next morning, break through to Sidi Bou Zid, rescue the trapped battalions. Colonel Robert Stack, commanding the counterattack force, looked at the order and felt his stomach tighten. His unit had never fought together as a formation. He had no reconnaissance of enemy positions, no air support confirmed, no clear intelligence on enemy strength. He was being ordered to attack into unknown terrain against an enemy that had just demonstrated overwhelming tactical superiority, but orders were orders. The counterattack launched at dawn on February 15th. Stack's tanks moved east from Spatler in a long column, exactly the formation German doctrine taught to avoid. They drove straight into a killing ground the Afrika Korps had prepared overnight. German anti-tank guns, dug into the hillsides and perfectly camouflaged, held fire until the American column was fully committed. Then they opened up. The lead American tanks exploded. The column bunched up, tanks colliding as drivers tried to reverse. German panzers appeared on the flanks, firing into the stalled formation. In less than an hour, Combat Command C lost 44 tanks, 59 other vehicles, and over 300 men. The survivors fled west. The trapped battalions at Sidi Bouzid would not be rescued. Rommel received reports of these engagements at his headquarters. He'd been ill, suffering from the stomach problems and exhaustion that plagued him throughout the North African campaign, but the opportunity before him was too significant to ignore. The Americans were scattered, poorly led, and demoralized. To the east, Montgomery's 8th Army was still regrouping after the long advance from Egypt. For a brief window, Rommel could strike west, smash the Americans, seize their supply dumps, perhaps even reach the coast and split the Allied forces. He ordered a general offensive. The objective, Kasserine Pass, a gap in the Atlas Mountains that led to the American supply base at Tebessa. The pass itself was a narrow defile, rocky hills rising on both sides, a single road winding through. American engineers had laid minefields, positioned artillery on the heights, prepared demolitions. If properly defended, Kasserine Pass could be held by a relatively small force. But proper defense required coordination, clear command, and troops who understood their mission. What it had instead was confusion. Units from 3 different American divisions had been thrown into the pass. Elements of the 1st Armored, the 34th Infantry, the 9th Infantry. Nobody had overall tactical command. Fredendall issued orders from his distant bunker, but those orders often contradicted each other or arrived too late to matter. Officers on the ground tried to establish defensive lines, but they didn't know what forces were on their flanks, didn't have clear communication with artillery, didn't know when or where the enemy would attack. Second Lieutenant William Wyant, 23 from Ohio, commanded a platoon of the 168th Infantry Regiment on the southern shoulder of the pass. His men had been in position for 2 days, digging foxholes in the rocky soil, stacking stones for cover. They could hear vehicle noises from the east, see dust clouds, but had no clear picture of what was coming. Wyant had sent 3 requests for reconnaissance up the chain of command. He'd received no response. On the night of February 19th, Wyant walked his platoon's line. His men were mostly draftees, average age 21, kids from farms and small towns who'd been in uniform less than a year. They asked him questions he couldn't answer. When would the attack come? How many Germans were out there? Would they have tank support? Air cover? Wyant told them what he could, tried to sound confident, but he was as uncertain as they were. The German assault began at dawn on February 20th. Artillery first, heavy concentration on the American positions, shells screaming down with the precision that came from veteran forward observers. Then the panzers, driving up the road in column, supported by infantry and half-tracks. The German tactics were textbook. Suppress with artillery, advance with armor, exploit with infantry. Wyant's platoon held for 20 minutes. They fired on the advancing infantry, knocked out one half-track with a bazooka. But German tanks were firing high explosive into their positions, and there was no American armor to counter them. The hillside became a chaos of explosions and flying rock. when a shell landed directly in Wyant's command post, killing his sergeant and both radio men. He knew the position was lost. He ordered withdrawal. Across the pass, the pattern repeated. American units fought hard, inflicted casualties, but they were fighting as isolated pockets, not as a coordinated defense. German forces punched through the center, then rolled up the flanks. By mid-afternoon, Kasserine Pass was in German hands, and American troops were streaming west in disorder. This was the moment when Rommel made his assessment. He'd watched American units fight for 6 days now. He'd seen their equipment, their tactics, their leadership. His report to German High Command was detailed and professional. The Americans, he wrote, had excellent material and numerical superiority. Their artillery was particularly impressive, their logistics formidable, but their tactics were poor, their leadership worse. They attacked in predictable patterns, defended static positions without depth, failed to coordinate infantry and armor. Most critically, their officers seemed unable to read the battlefield or adapt to changing circumstances. In his personal papers, later published as the Rommel Papers, he was more direct. The Americans had not yet learned the art of war. But Rommel also noted something else, something that would prove prophetic. The Americans learned quickly. Units that broke on the first day fought better on the second. Officers who survived began to understand. The potential was there, Rommel wrote. Given time and experience, these troops would become formidable. He didn't have time to exploit his victory. Supply problems, the same chronic shortages that had plagued him throughout the African campaign, limited his advance. British reinforcements were arriving from the north. Montgomery was pressing from the east. On February 22nd, Rommel ordered withdrawal. The Afrika Korps pulled back through Kasserine Pass, returned to their original positions. They'd inflicted a sharp defeat, captured thousands of prisoners, destroyed hundreds of vehicles. But they hadn't achieved the strategic breakthrough Rommel needed. The cost to the Americans was severe. Approximately 300 killed, 3,000 wounded, 3,000 captured. Entire battalions had been destroyed. Equipment losses were staggering. Over 200 tanks, 200 artillery pieces, 500 other vehicles. But the real damage was psychological. The American army had come to North Africa confident, even cocky. Kasserine Pass shattered that confidence. Private Rosen, who'd survived the initial attack at Sidi Bou Zid and the retreat through Kasserine, ended up at a collection point near Tebessa. Hundreds of men were there, from a dozen different units, many wounded, all exhausted. Nobody seemed to know what had happened or what would happen next. Rosen sat on the ground, his uniform torn and filthy, and tried to process what he'd experienced. 6 days ago, he'd been a soldier in a modern army. Now he felt like a survivor of a catastrophe. But something was already changing. Officers were arriving, taking charge, organizing the chaos. Medical teams were treating wounded. Supply trucks were distributing food and ammunition. The American logistics machine, that vast system of supply and support, was responding. And more importantly, people were asking questions. What went wrong? Why did we lose? How do we fix it? General Dwight Eisenhower, commanding all Allied forces in North Africa, arrived at the front. He relieved Fredendall of command, replaced him with Major General George Patton. Eisenhower had seen enough. The underground bunker 70 miles from the front, the scattered dispositions, the confused command structure, all of it had to change. Patton arrived like a storm, demanding immediate improvements in discipline, training, and leadership. Patton's first address to Second Corps was blunt. They'd been beaten, he told them, because they'd fought like amateurs. That would change. Training intensified. Officers who couldn't lead were relieved. Tactics were revised based on hard lessons learned. The doctrine of combined arms, infantry and armor working together, artillery integrated into every operation, became not just theory, but practice. Lieutenant Wyant, recovering from wounds received at Kasserine, attended a new training program established by Patton. For 2 weeks, officers reviewed every engagement, analyzed what went wrong, studied German tactics. The instructors were veterans. Some British officers who'd fought Rommel in Egypt, some American officers who'd performed well at Kasserine. The lessons were specific and practical. How to position tanks for mutual support, how to coordinate artillery with infantry advance, how to read terrain, how to recognize German tactical patterns. Wyant filled a notebook with observations. The Germans always reconnoitered thoroughly before attacking. They used terrain to approach undercover. They concentrated force at the decisive point rather than spreading out. They adapted quickly when plans failed. These weren't secrets, Wyant realized. They were basics, fundamentals his unit had neglected or never properly learned. Kasserine had been an expensive education, but it was an education. The American army that emerged from this crucible was different from the one that entered it. When Second Corps next engaged German forces at El Guetar in March 1943, they fought with new competence. American artillery, always strong, now coordinated devastating barrages. Infantry and armor worked together. Officers read the battlefield better, adapted faster. The Germans still had tactical advantages, still fought with veteran skill, but the gap was closing. Rommel, increasingly ill and frustrated by supply problems, left Afrika in March. He would never fight Americans again, but his assessment at Kasserine proved both accurate and incomplete. Accurate in that the Americans of February 1943 genuinely hadn't learned the art of war. Incomplete in that he'd underestimated how quickly they would learn. By the time Tunisia fell to the Allies in May 1943, the American army bore little resemblance to the force that stumbled through Kasserine Pass. The same soldiers, many of them, but transformed by experience and training. They would carry those lessons to Sicily, to Italy, to Normandy. Every American officer who planned D-Day had studied Kasserine. Every battalion that landed in France had incorporated its lessons. Private Rosen would fight through Sicily and Italy, would eventually make sergeant, would survive the war. In later years, when people asked about his combat experience, he always started with Kasserine. Not because he was proud of it, but because it taught him what war actually was. All the training in California, all the lectures and exercises, hadn't prepared him for the reality of facing veteran German troops. Kasserine had been the real school. Lieutenant Wyant, promoted to captain, would command a company in Italy. He kept the notebook from Patton's training program, referred to it before every operation. The lessons from Kasserine, he believed, saved his life multiple times. Know your enemy. Use terrain. Coordinate your forces. Adapt or die. Simple principles, learned the hard way. The debate about Kasserine Pass would continue for decades. Historians would argue about Fredendall's competence, about whether Eisenhower should have intervened sooner, about tactical decisions at every level, but certain facts remained undisputed. The Americans had entered the battle inexperienced and poorly led. They'd been beaten by superior force using superior tactics, and they'd learned from the defeat. Rommel's assessment that the Americans had not yet learned the art of war was accurate for February 1943, but the key word was yet. The American capacity for learning, for adapting, for applying industrial-scale resources to solving military problems would prove decisive. Kasserine was the low point, but it was also the turning point. The German forces that won at Kasserine would surrender in Tunisia 10 weeks later, trapped by the same Allied forces they'd defeated. Rommel's Afrika Corps, undefeated in 3 years of desert warfare, would cease to exist. The Americans they'd beaten in February would be among the forces accepting their surrender in May. In his final assessment of the North African campaign, written after his return to Germany, Rommel reflected on the American army. Their initial performance had been poor, he wrote, but their improvement was remarkable. They learned faster than any opponent he'd faced. They adapted their doctrine, trained their troops, and applied their massive material advantages with increasing skill. The Americans, Rommel concluded, would be formidable opponents in the campaigns to come. He was right. The army that landed at Normandy on June 6, 1944, bore the lessons of Kasserine Pass in every operation order, every tactical decision, every coordination between infantry and armor. The mistakes of February 1943 had been studied, analyzed, and corrected. American officers who'd survived Kasserine now commanded divisions and corps. They knew what worked against German tactics because they'd learned through failure. The soldiers themselves carried those lessons too. Veterans of Kasserine, scattered throughout the army, told their stories to new replacements. Don't underestimate the Germans. Don't attack without reconnaissance. Don't separate your armor from infantry support. Stay flexible, adapt to circumstances, learn from mistakes. These weren't abstract principles, but hard-won knowledge purchased with blood in a Tunisian mountain pass. Kasserine Pass entered American military tradition as a cautionary tale, studied at West Point and command schools. But it was also studied as a story of resilience, of an army that could absorb a severe defeat and emerge stronger. The ability to learn from failure, to adapt and improve, proved as important as any tactical doctrine. Rommel's words, that the Americans had not yet learned the art of war, became both epitaph for the old American army and prophecy for the new one. The army that fought at Kasserine Pass died there, in a sense. The army that emerged from that defeat would help win the war. For the men who fought through those 6 days in February 1943, Kasserine remained a defining experience. They'd seen what happened when inexperience met expertise, when good intentions met hard reality. They'd learned that war was not what they'd imagined in training camps, that combat against veteran troops required skills they hadn't possessed. But they'd also learned they could acquire those skills, could become the soldiers they needed to be. Rommel had assessed them accurately in that moment. But that moment passed. The Americans learned their art, learned it quickly and well, and applied it with the massive resources only America could provide. By the time the war ended, the question wasn't whether Americans had learned the art of war. The question was whether anyone could stand against them once they had.